11 of the fantasy football season, and here starts it sits at the wide receiver position for every matchup. The first matchup, Tennessee Titans at the Green Bay Packers on Thursday Night Football. So right here, this Titan team, it's pretty much been Derrick Henry or bust this season on the offense. Last week, Westbrook-Ikhine had 5 catches, 119 yards, and 2 touchdowns. But this week here, I don't like any Tennessee wide receiver really. Robert Woods, he hasn't done much anything at all this season. Treylon Burks, he just came back at 3 catches, 24 yards in that ball game for them last week versus the Denver Broncos. And Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, no doubt about it, had a breakout ball game. But I think it was a little fluky as well. So right now, all these guys are sits for me this week. Now to the Green Bay Packers side of things, Allen Lazard, he's a start pretty much each and every week as the number 1 wide receiver in this Packer offense. I know last week he didn't have a great ball game versus the Dallas Cowboys. That's because Christian Watson outperformed everybody, and he had his finally breakout ball game in his rookie year. 4 catches, 107 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And Watson, believe it or not, he left some plays on the table, dropping a deep ball early in the game, and then another pass that would have went for another 30 or 40 yards. So right now, Christian Watson, he has big receiver ability, big speed, no doubt about it, and a guy that could be a deep threat now for this Packer team. He really hasn't gotten the opportunity this season, and injuries have played a factor, but now with the opportunity in Week 10 he had versus the Dallas Cowboys, he broke out, and he's a guy that's got to be in there a majority of the ball game, in my opinion, for this Packer team. Romeo Doubs, we don't know when he's going to come back. He's got the high ankle sprain, but Watson was a second-round draft pick for a reason for this Packer team. So right now, he's a guy who would start this week as a flex option or low-end number 2 wide receiver. And Sammy Watkins, I'm sitting in this game. Reports are coming out, Randall Cobb might be back. But right here, if I'm this Packer team, after seeing what they did with a deep ball threat in Watson and Lazard got to be the wide receivers on the field at all times. Now to the Philadelphia Eagles at the Indianapolis Colts. A.J. Brown had the worst game in his Philadelphia Eagle career with only 1.70 fantasy points in that Week 10 loss versus the Washington Commanders. But this week here versus the Indianapolis Colts indoor game, and where this Philadelphia Eagle team I know is going to come out chomping at the bit after losing a tough one to a team they should have handled and beat in the division here. I think A.J. Brown comes out with a big ball game, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has 100 yards and a touchdown. Devonta Smith coming off a solid ball game after weeks of just mediocre ball games. He's a start as well. And each and every week, these 2 wide receivers on this Eagle team, you got to play. I know some weeks they're not going to do anything, but you're not going to want these guys on your bench when they break out. So I would start a Michael Pittman Jr. He looked decent last week in Matt Ryan's return, so he's a start for me. And Paris Campbell is a borderline option. I know Campbell's had a lot of targets, and he's been playing great football with Matt Ryan this season, but still, as a number 2 wide receiver, I don't know if I could trust him. As a 3 or flex guy, definitely for Paris Campbell. But this week here, I don't think he's going to do what he did again last week. Last week, he did break out a 30-yard plus touchdown, which made his fantasy day. But right here, this week, I have him as a borderline option. If he has another big game with Matt Ryan once again this week, then he's a guy you possibly could start each and every week. Alec Pierce, he had a couple flash games early in the season, but hasn't done nothing the last 2 or 3 weeks. And he's an easy sit for me this week. Now to the Los Angeles Rams at the New Orleans Saints. And this is pretty simple here. Matthew Stafford, we don't know who's going to play. Cooper Kupp, he's out for many weeks with a high ankle sprain and surgery on the ankle. And Allen Robinson's done nothing this season. Ben Skowronek, he's a slot guy, but you're not going to expect much out of him. And Van Jefferson, I know he scored a touchdown last week, but it's not meaning much. It was in garbage time of that ball game. So all Ram wide receivers, I'm sitting this week. Now to the New Orleans Saints, Chris Olave. I know it was a down week for him last week with only 7 fantasy points. But this week here, I think he has a decent game. I think he bounces back. And believe it if not, if Jameis Winston does start this game, his value could go up because Winston could stretch the field more than Andy Dalton. So Olave's a start, and Jarvis Landry came back last week, but not much impact. And I think Landry's best seasons are behind him, so he's a sit for me this week. Now to the Chicago Bears at the Atlanta Falcons. Right here, Darnell Mooney, he's been pretty solid this season. I know he's had 1 good game, 1 bad game type of deal, but right here, this Falcon team gives up the most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. I'm going to give Darnell Mooney the nod, even though we know this offense is all fields running and Cole Kmet in the red zone. But right now, Darnell Mooney gets the start this week. And Chase Claypool, he's a guy set to drop early in the week, and he just hasn't done anything with his new team. And like I said, Justin Fields, it's all about running the football, getting him out of the pocket, and just hitting the tight end Cole Kmet pretty much. And Mooney, Chase Claypool hasn't done much. I don't know how fantasy owners, even in a heavy bye week once again, could count on him. I have him as a sit now. To the Falcons side of things, Drake London, pretty solid matchup. Home game here for the Atlanta Falcons. I know Marcus Mariota don't throw the football a lot, and especially London's way, but London at least came off a 5-catch, 38-yard touchdown game last week for the Atlanta Falcons versus the Panthers. And this week here versus the Bears, I think he's a decent number 2 wide receiver. Flex option is London, and I got him to start this week. Hadario Hodge, he's been a deep ball threat for this Falcon team, but still a guy available in tons of fantasy leagues, over 95%, and not a guy just yet on the fantasy radar. If he could do it for another couple weeks, I say he would be. But this week here, he's a sit once again. Now to the Commanders at the Houston Texans. Right now, Terry McLaurin, he's been playing great football and possibly the best football of his career since Taylor Heineke's been inserted into the starting lineup after Carson Wentz went down with injuries. So scary Terry, great matchup at Houston. Don't have to say much. He's a star. Curtis Samuel, solid number 2 and gadget wide receiver as well, where they've used him on end arounds and some rush attempts here. He's a start as well for me. And Jahan Dotson, he came back, but he didn't do anything in that ball game. A 1 catch for 14 yards in Week 10 versus Philly, so you can't trust him right now. You can have him a bench stash, but he's a sit. And now to the Texan side of things, Brandon Cooks, he pretty much is mailing it in towards the end of the season and wanted out at the trade deadline, but obviously that didn't happen, and you can't trust him. He's a borderline option. And Nico Collins, it was good to see him score a touchdown in last week's ball game versus the New York Giants, but I got to see a little more out of him, and he's got to stay healthy as well, so I got him as a sit. But if he could go out there and have one more good ball game, is Nico Collins. He's definitely a guy on the fantasy radar week in and week out. Now to the New York Jets at the New England Patriot. Garrett Wilson, the last 2-3 weeks here, him and Zach Wilson have a good rapport. And the Jet team, they got to get the ball to their playmakers. With Breece Hall out, there's not much on this offense. Elijah Moore has been non-existent. Corey Davis is banged up, non-existent. And Garrett Wilson, the last few games here, has been a playmaker and was drafted as one of the top wide receivers in the NFL draft for a reason this season. So this week here, I'll have confidence, and I would start him. Corey Davis and Moore, like I said, they really haven't done much. And Zach Wilson, he has no chemistry pretty much with any of these guys. Garrett Wilson, he's getting by on just getting open and catching the football with his playmaker and great receiving techniques. But right here, Corey Davis and Moore, they've done nothing the last few weeks, and you can't start them. So they're easy sits this week. And now to the Patriots, Jacoby Myers, a few weeks ago versus the New York Jets. A nice fantasy game with 20-plus fantasy points in PPR leagues. And this week here, even versus a tough Jet defense, him and Mac Jones have a good rapport. And I like Myers as a solid number 2 flex option. And to start this week, Tyquan Thornton had one breakout game 4 or 5 weeks ago. We haven't seen much from him. He's a sit. And Devontae Parker, he just can't stay healthy. Would it be surprising to me if he has a decent fantasy day this week? No, but there's so many receivers this season with more upside and better options than Devontae Parker. And I got him as a sit this week. Now to the Detroit Lions at the New York Giants. Amon St. Brown, finally a breakout game once again. Go over in 100 yards at the Chicago Bears. So he's an easy start this week. He's a guy I'm starting regardless. He's Jared Goff's number 1 option, and maybe he's starting to get healthier, is St. Brown. After a little concussion issue and an ankle issue early in the season, Josh Reynolds, we haven't seen him in the last few weeks. But even if he plays in this one, I just can't trust him. He's been inconsistent. Had a few decent games earlier, but he's a sit. And Khalif Raymond, even in the deepest of leagues, I wouldn't start him. He's been inconsistent. He's a slot guy for this Lion team. And this offense is pretty much Amon St. Brown, Jamal Williams, and Swift. So he's a sit this week is Raymond. Now to the Giants, Darius Slayton. He's been putting up numbers and acting as the number 1 wide receiver over there in New York. But I don't know still if he's still going to be the guy week in and week out you can count on as a start. So this week here, I have him as a borderline option. But with injuries, obviously, and bye weeks, some teams are probably going to have to play him as their flex option or third receiver in 3 receivers leagues. And Wanda Robinson, he was good since he came back from injury the first couple weeks, but the last couple weeks he's failed to reach 4 fantasy points in the last two ball games. So this week here, if you want to play him in deeper leagues, possibly, if I got him as a borderline option at best, but I'm leaning towards a sit as well from what we've seen the last few games now to the Panthers at the Baltimore Ravens. So DJ Moore, I know he don't have good chemistry at all with Baker Mayfield, who's going to start in this ball game once again for this Carolina Panther team with PJ Walker out. But one more week, I'm going to give DJ Moore a chance. If he can't get anything done in this ball game versus a Raven defense that gives up a decent amount of fantasy points, top 10 in fantasy points given up to wide receivers on the season, then DJ Moore, you're going to sit in. Terrace Marshall, he had a good rapport with PJ Walker, but with Baker Mayfield, I can't trust him. He's an easy sit this week. And even a guy that I wouldn't be surprised if he only gets a couple fantasy points in this one. Now to the Ravens, Devin Duvernay, he's acting as the number one wide receiver with Rashad Bateman out for the season. Duvernay, he really hasn't done much this season. So right now, if you're in a pinch and he is the number one guy, like I mentioned, he's a borderline option for me this week. Deshaun Jackson, he played a couple snaps in that game, tightened the hamstring in week 9 at the New Orleans Saints. But he's a guy that's going to see the field once again. He should be ready to go. But he's just not a fantasy option at this point. It's just Deshaun Jackson. Maybe later in the season he can be, but he's a sit this week. And DeMarcus Robinson had a couple targets in that ball game at the Saints, but only ended with 2.20 fantasy points. He's a sit for me, but I think he's a guy as well that can have some value down the line is Robinson, but not this week. Now to the Cleveland Browns at the Buffalo Bills. So Amari Cooper, he's been a pretty solid wide receiver this season here for this Cleveland Brown team. I know obviously on the road to home splits, it's a night and day thing here for Amari Cooper, but this week here, with the bye weeks and a lot of injuries over the last couple weeks around the league, I'm going to have him as a start. And out to Donovan Peoples-Jones, he's quickly becoming a very solid number 2 wide receiver for this Cleveland Brown team. But this week here with a tough matchup at the Buffalo Bills, I'm going to put him as a borderline option. But if he overcomes this matchup and has another great game as Peoples-Jones, he's a guy you're going to start each and every week, especially with Deshaun Watson back, where he really could stretch the field to a guy like Peoples-Jones. Now to the Buffalo Bills side of things, Stephon Diggs, another great season for him. He's a start each and every week. Gabe Davis finally another nice game with 20 fantasy points and finding the end zone. And this week here, he's a feast of famine wide receiver, but he's a guy you got to play. Him and Devonta Smith are those type of receivers where they can have those monster games or do games where they do nothing, and you pretty much draft them and have them in your lineup every week, or you don't draft them and forget about them. But I'm having Diggs and Davis as starts this week, and Isaiah McKenzie, the slot receiver, obviously, for this Buffalo Bill team. And I'm going to have him as a borderline option. This Bill team, they spread the football around all over the field here is Josh Allen. One week it could be even Shakir coming out of nowhere for this team. But right now, he's a borderline option at best. Is McKenzie. Now to the Raiders at the Denver Broncos. Davante Adams, one bad game a few weeks ago, and ever since then, he's been putting on some monster performances. And he's a must-start and a top 5 receiver week in and week out. Matt Collins, number 2 wide receiver, now over there in Las Vegas, but he just hasn't gotten the job done over the last few weeks. Even with Hunter Renfrow out, he's a sit for me. And now to the Broncos, Courtland Sutton is the number 2-3 wide receiver, is a decent option this week versus a Raider team that really don't stop anybody. So I got cut starting as a start, and Jerry Jeudy, if he does play in this ball game, I have him as a sit. We just haven't seen much out of Jeudy. He's been injury prone throughout his career, and him and Russell Wilson just haven't been on the same page really this season. So he's a sit for me if he plays a not out to the Bengals at the Pittsburgh Steelers. Jamar Chase, it looks like he's not going to play, but if he does, obviously he's a stud wide receiver and a guy you start week in and week out. But Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, they're going to be starters once again for me. Tyler Boyd, he's had a couple great games this season, and him and Joe Burrow always have a good rapport, and he's the safety valve here for Joe Burrow as well at that wide receiver position. So Tyler Boyd I like, and T. Higgins is a solid number 2 flex option for fantasy owners, where you know you're going to get that 13, 20 fantasy points pretty much weekly, and right here in a pretty good matchup at the Steelers. All these wide receivers I like over there in Cincinnati. Now to the Steelers side of things, I think in this one they're going to be trailing early and often. I know week 1 it was a different type of game script where the Bengals were the team trailing, but right now this Steelers team, their offense really hasn't done much. I know last week they beat the New Orleans Saints, but Deontay Johnson, it's been a down year for him, no doubt about it. George Pickens last week, a solid ball game with a rushing touchdown and over 13 fantasy points. And this week here, if they got to play catch-up, I like both wide receivers in this division matchup, especially with the bye weeks and injuries. Johnson and Pickens. I have his starts. Dallas Cowboys at the Minnesota Vikings. CeeDee Lamb, best game of the season here for him last week, cutting up that Green Bay Packers secondary with over 30 fantasy points, and I got him as a start this week. Michael Gallup, he just hasn't shown it this season here. Now this team interested in Odell Beckham. We'll see if that comes to fruition and they sign him. But Michael Gallup, he's failed to reach more than 8 fantasy points over the last few weeks here, and he's a sit for me. Justin Jefferson, what a ball game last week. Put his name really on the map. One of the best catches of all time. No doubt about it from Justin Jefferson. A monster fantasy game, 193 yards and a touchdown. And this week here, we just saw this Cowboys secondary get toasted by Christian Watson. I see Jefferson having another monster performance this week, and he's a start. And Adam Thielen is an underneath guy and a nice number 2 wide receiver for this Minnesota Viking team. I have as a start as well because Anthony Brown is hurt, and this Cowboys secondary is thinning out as well. Kansas City Chiefs at the Chargers on Sunday Night Football. Juju Smith-Schuster, we know he's in concussion protocol, but if he does play in this ball game, I got him as a start. He's been great for this Kansas City Chiefs team, and a true number 1 wide receiver. Now the Mecole Hardman, if he plays in this ball game after coming off a rib injury, I would give him a start as well. They're using him as a deep ball threat in the Tyreek Hill type of role this season. Here's this Kansas City Chief team, and these guys are playing good football. Now to the sit side of things, Kadarius Toney, if these guys are playing, obviously he's a sit, but obviously if they don't play one of them, he's a start for me. Toney, they traded a few weeks ago from the New York Giants, and this guy's a playmaker. We saw it last season with the Giants. He's a great talent. He can run the routes. He's got that breakaway speed, and if obviously those guys are out in Hardman or Schuster, or even one of them, he's a start for me this week. But right now, if they all play, Toney's a sit because he's still the 4th wide receiver, and MVS, he's been playing decent football, but he's just a guy that's obviously been up and down throughout his career, going back to his Packer days, and even this season. One week he'll get 15 fantasy points, and then the next week 2 or 3 fantasy points. So right here, he's tough to trust, and if both those receivers are out, then maybe I have him as a start. But right now, he's a sit. Now to the Chargers side of things, Keenan Allen, he might play in this ball game. Him and Williams are supposed to practice this week, whatever that means, if they're going to play or not. But obviously, if Allen and Williams are going to play, they're going to be starts. These guys are top talents. They're solid number 2 wide receivers for fantasy owners. And with a good quarterback like a Justin Herbert, they could get back into the thick of things and be good starts this week. Now, Joshua Palmer, I would start him this week if one or both of these guys are out, because if they're both out, once again, he'll be operating as the number 1 wide receiver, even though I know last week he had a dud performance, is Joshua Palmer. And now to DeAndre Carter, he's a borderline option. Obviously, if 1 or 2 of those guys missed the ball game last week, 64 yards and a touchdown here for DeAndre Carter. And we know he's a good slot and a speedy guy, that him and Justin Herbert have a decent rapport. So right now, I got him as a borderline option this week. But obviously, if those guys are out, he could have another great game once again. And now the final game of the week, San Francisco 49ers at the Arizona Cardinals. So Deebo Samuel, it hasn't been that great of a season, but to be honest, I don't think he's 100% as well as Deebo. But this week here versus a division rival and an extra day of rest on Monday Night Football, I like Deebo Samuel as a start. We know he's a gadget guy. We know he can make the big plays and burn secondaries. And this week here versus a Cardinal team where he has a good track record, I like him as a start. And Brandon Ayuk, he's coming on of late as well. Over the last few weeks, here's Brandon Ayuk. So he's a guy who would start as well with a thin wide receiver position with injuries the last few weeks. In the bye weeks, he's a start. DeAndre Hopkins, ever since he came off suspension, he's had some monster fantasy games besides one game. And he's a start even with Colt McCoy at quarterback or Kyler Murray. He's just locked in. He's making the plays, and he's getting the job done for the Cardinals and fantasy owners. And Rondé Moore as well, no matter who the quarterback's been, he's getting double-digit fantasy points. And once again here in a matchup where they could be chasing points or just going up and down the field here with both teams, I like Rondé Moore as a start as well. So that's wide receiver, starter, sit every matchup this week for Week 11 of the fantasy football season.